Hello and welcome. This is Lisa Jones, and you are listening to the Exploring Death podcast. Hello, it's Lisa Jones with the Exploring Death podcast, and today I have with me Dr. Eben Alexander. He thought he had a very good idea of how the brain generates consciousness, mind, and spirit as a neurosurgeon. And then, as discussed in his book, Proof of Heaven, in the pre-dawn hours of November 10th, 2008, he was driven into a coma by a rare and mysterious bacterial meningitis encephalitis of unknown cause. He spent a week in a coma on a ventilator. His prospects for survival were diminishing rapidly. On the seventh day, to the surprise of everyone, he started to awaken. Memories of his earthly life had been completely deleted inside of the coma, yet he awoke with memories of a fantastic odyssey, deep into another realm, more real than this earthly one. Today, he will share some details and lessons learned from his near-death experience and his evolving understanding about consciousness and the power of unconditional love. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Well, Lisa, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you on the show. And we met 2 years ago, actually, at the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Mm-hmm. And then again, this year, we ran into each other. And I definitely want to talk about your near-death experience. But one of the concepts or aspects that you dive into, which I've never heard from anyone else, is the adoption story, which was part of really the proof that you felt opened this whole experience for you. So what would you like to say?
Well, it's fascinating. The adoption angle is absolutely crucial. In fact, there's no way for me to even look at my whole story and all the big lessons of my life and the NDE and the meningitis and every bit of it without acknowledging very profoundly the crucial role of my adoption. And I get into that a little bit in Proof of Heaven because I also discuss in there the adoption issue around the fact that, that it had created such a hole in my life. And I didn't know that. I couldn't really remember. I didn't have the memories because I've been given up for adoption by my birth mother, who was 16 years old and unmarried, when I was 11 days old. That's basically when I went through that trauma of being left behind by my mother. Now, it turns out that, and a lot of this is spelled out in Proof of Heaven, but it turns out that she tried to keep me. So, in fact, she was working hard behind the scenes to try and bring me home, even though in 1954 in North Carolina, that was not very likely for a 16-year-old high school student. But the adoption part was just a huge part of my story. In fact, in our third book, which is the true sequel to Proof of Heaven, and here is the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, we go into much more detail about the adoption story. And very specifically, there's a synchronicity that is just shocking to me. It has to do with the fact that it's a synchronicity that's gigantic and vast and it includes several decades of my life. And it's all about the adoption story. To kind of cut to the chase on that, because I don't want to take up too much time on it, but that synchronicity has to do with the fact that my career in vascular neurosurgery, aneurysms, arteriovenous malformations, that's what I went into in the 1980s. I finished Duke Medical School in 1980. I had given up on my search for my birth mother years before that, and it just adjusted to the fact, okay, she's not out there looking for me, so forget about it. And that was the environment I was in when I was training to be a neurosurgeon. And it turns out, though, that the interesting feature is that one of the reasons we could actually reconnect, now, to spell this out, in the 1980s, finished Duke Medical School, then went into residency all through the 80s, finished my residency in 1987, did 2 years of lab work on subarachnoid hemorrhage, vasospasm, which is all about aneurysms and AVMs, and then did a fellowship in England in 1987, training to be a vascular neurosurgeon, to clip aneurysms and all that. And it was years later, in fact, beginning around 2000, as I explained in Proof of Heaven, when I first had some new information coming in from my birth family, because I found out they were out there, that found out that in fact, my birth mother's father had died of an aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage in 1966. He was probably seen by my father as a neurosurgeon consultant, although there was no way they could have known about their connection over me. And then likewise, my birth mother's youngest sister, she had two sisters, one of them died in 1978 of a subarachnoid hemorrhage from an aneurysm. So all this was going on in the background, and in fact, connected the dots, because the only way that when I contacted the children's home in 2000 and got more information about my birth family, the only way that could happen was because I actually had a birth sister who knew of these hemorrhages, also knew that I might exist, even though she knew it only peripherally through her grandmother. But she was passing information back to the children's home all through the late 80s and 90s to help me to come to know about this familial risk of subarachnoid hemorrhage. It's a long, complex, amazing story, but it's a giant synchronicity of my entire career, which was laying out there in the 70s and 80s, going into vascular neurosurgery, but only finding out in the year 2000 and beyond that I could connect to my birth family because of the information trail of my sister informing the children's home about all those subarachnoid hemorrhages, which of course she knew were familial, that I needed to be warned about it so I could monitor myself, because I'm at risk for having a subarachnoid hemorrhage from aneurysm. But the bottom line is the whole thing in the context of my adoption story and how that fits into my near-death experience is a profound, very deeply interwoven synchronicity over many decades across multiple levels of kind of my career selection in my life. And the other thing that, of course, is important to point out in the adoption context is that those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize that that story is all about someone who did not feel worthy of love. That was basically a result of my being put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. And even though my father, who was an academic neurosurgeon, told me all my life there was no way I could remember anything that had happened when I was only days or weeks old, I came to realize he was wrong. That in fact, it was the only memory I had, was that I'd been left behind, that I wasn't good enough for my mother. And a lot of children who are abandoned like that stop eating. They go on a hunger strike. They basically know they have no reason to be. And that was my kind of life assumption for many years, even though I knew intellectually, and I knew from my adoptive family, who were very loving and totally honored my hopes and dreams. And I had 3 beautiful sisters in that family and 2 very loving parents in my adoptive family. And yet at the core of it all, there was this kind of self-doubt that all came way back in those first 11 days of life when my mother left me behind. So in many ways, Proof of Heaven is about a journey of someone who discovers their connection to the universe and their love, and the love that is there for them through a near-death experience that takes me all the way back to the beginning of my adoption story and being put up for adoption when I was 11 days old. So the whole thing is an incredibly rich, interwoven story that, in looking back on it, is just amazing. Although, of course, as it all unfolded, you know, many times I was just in wonder about it all. And not all of it was not necessarily pleasant. A lot of that not feeling worthy of love was a real challenge in my life. And my NDE proved very powerfully to help me come back into a natural connection with the universe. And that's what I think is one of the fundamental and most important lessons of near-death experiences, because I would say that all of us, all human beings, basically have an abandonment wound from being separated from source, from that divine source, when we first come into this world, into this existence, coming from those heavenly realms. And of course, another piece to really get the big picture here is you can't understand any of this really big picture notion of consciousness in the modern era without realizing that the evidence for reincarnation is very strong. There's tremendous scientific evidence for it. More than 2,500 cases studied at University of Virginia over the last 6 decades. And so in other words, we're all coming into this life, but we've lived previous lifetimes. And there's a very powerful program of forgetting so that we don't necessarily remember things except in certain circumstances. But
Wow.
I think the adoption picture, and especially what it's shown me about the universality of that abandonment wound, how all of us struggle with that. And we, especially in our modern materialistic culture, that claims that the physical world is all that exists, scientific materialism, that the brain must be creating consciousness, we start to realize when we see that model fails under all the modern examination of consciousness, and we must now look at the afterlife and reincarnation as absolutely real based on scientific evidence, we now need a much bigger picture of what it all means and how each and every one of us has come to some understanding of our purpose in life. But first and foremost is to realize that we're all those divine beings that are directly connected to the sacred and divine power of that loving God force that I and so many millions of others throughout thousands of years have come to see as at the core of our very conscious awareness. So it
Right.
really, the adoption story weaves into it beautifully. I'm glad you brought that up. But in
Yes. Well,
some
and
ways, when
thank you. I
people
mean, you brought me to tears. I was completely enraptured by what you were saying. My whole body was chilling, which to me is a divine, like, yes. And it just goes back. I didn't have quite I mean, your story of your studies that brought you literally to confrontation with, your birth family having that disease that you'd been studying is tremendous. I have a little similar story. I was given up for adoption. My mother was 20, college student, unmarried, 1966, and a minister's daughter to top it all off, right? So not allowed to keep me. So yeah, for 12 days, I don't know where I was. I mean, I was taken from her, put into a room. Apparently, obviously somebody fed me, and then my adoptive parents came and took me. And again, I had a beautiful life, loving mom and dad that cared for me. But it's only recently, really after I had my shared death experience and wrote my book, that this whole wound of feeling unloved, this abandonment issue, has come up. So I want to come back and touch on that. But my quick story of synchronicity is when I did meet my birth mother, and my adoptive mother was there too. She was chatting with my birth grandparents. And it turns out that my great grandfather went to high school with my adoptive grandfather. And in 1922, there's a picture of the football team, and they're standing there's two men in between them, but literally shoulder to shoulder in 1922, these two men. And I was born in 1966. And that was in Iowa. I was adopted in Colorado. Again, there was no way that this was anything other than total synchronicity.
Well, to me, it points out there are no accidents. And this is
Right.
something Karen, my life partner, my co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe, share all the time as we hear these stories. And more, you just cannot make this stuff up. It's so astonishing, these connections. I mean, another little connection I have along those lines, just to mention this same thing, is that my father was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, basically, I think 32 to 36. And it turns out that about 5 years earlier, my birth grandfather had lived right down the hallway in that very same dormitory from where my dad ended up a few years later. And then, of course, as I said, when that same grandfather ended up having a subarachnoid hemorrhage from an aneurysm in 1966, after about 2 weeks of lying in an outside hospital in coma, they took him to Winston-Salem, where my dad was the head of neurosurgery. So Dad probably saw him as a patient, even though he had no way of knowing that this was the grandfather of the son that he adopted in 1954. So,
wow. My whole body is chilling.
Lots of little interconnections. And if you're not open-minded and not, paying attention to the patterns, you miss all this. And yet there's a tremendous amount of information, just as Carl Jung came to realize, that synchronicities are very important. They're a tremendous kind of wink and a nudge from the universe about a deeper reality that connects us all. And as much as the materialist scientists and me before my coma would have said, oh, well, that's an interesting coincidence, I've since my coma, I've obviously come to see a much bigger value in examining all these connections and putting the patterns together and realizing that even though they don't have a material causal link, they've got something even deeper underlying them that shows there's a lot of purpose in our existence. And in many ways, parts of our lives, I think in many ways are predetermined, kind of from our higher soul perspective. But the free will comes into how we deal with a lot of those challenges and hardships that
I love that. I just recently kind of came to that as well. The whole idea that I think there is a lot of predetermination. Again, I don't want to be fatalistic, but the things that have happened in my life, I'm like, I just don't know how these could have happened unless, it was all meant to be. And it just somehow keeps unfolding.
It really is amazing, but that's a beautiful synchronicity about your
I know it's amazing. And the fact that we even found it, because I mentioned it to my adopted grandmother, and then she went and looked at the Essex, Iowa, which literally I think like 500 people live in Essex, Iowa. So, it just even brings it that much tighter and smaller to realize what a small community it was. And but I do want to circle back because, like you said, that there's this natural connection with the universe, and yet we all tend to have this abandonment wound because we've all come and been separated from that. And I think those of us that have been adopted feel that even more fully in this physical realm. And I have to say, I've really struggled these last few years, just really trying to find my way in belonging here, because I feel, that little infant baby wound that, like you said, like who could imagine that we could actually remember that or feel that? And yet I've done a ton of work this past year specifically on this inner child wound, and it just keeps coming up and keeps coming up. And I would love to know if you found any answers as to how to really fill that hole that we feel in our hearts.
Yeah, well, that's actually a very good point. Now, it turns out another part of my personal story, and I mentioned this briefly in Proof of Heaven, but I don't dwell on it a lot, but it has to do with the fact I'm a recovering alcoholic. I stopped drinking in 1991. And I think that plays in a little bit, because I think those kind of things are always kind of soul challenges that are there to help us grow, but they can be, dangerous if they're not properly managed, if we don't work our way through. And in fact, I would say our whole world today is paying a price because of this secular kind of vacuum, the spiritual vacuum in our modern culture. Religions used to provide some form of spirituality to a majority of people in our culture. And the effect of religion has diminished in recent years, which I think is very unfortunate. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that many of our religions, the religious orthodoxies, can be conflicting. And so they get very confusing. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people have fallen away from them. And I think also because the religions, the way they're practiced, have gotten away from the original messages of the prophets, which in many ways are all the same. I mean, really, this is all about oneness, about love, kindness, compassion, mercy. That's what the origins of religions were there to teach us. And yet our modern religions have kind of lost sight of all that. And in fact, our world, the United States in particular, is in some deep trouble right now. The health of a society can be gauged by actuarial survival curves. How long do people live? And in the United States, the last time those curves took a downward dip was at the end of World War I in 1918 and 1919. And because of all the trauma to the world at the time, our life expectancy dipped. But ever since then, it's been going up. And of course, modern medicine has played a tremendous role. And everything getting better, we living longer. And yet in 2017, those curves going up all of a sudden started going down again for the first time in almost a century. Very dire picture of our kind of health of our world. And the culprit there is not the normal suspects of diabetes and cancer and heart attacks and stroke, but actually is the opioid crisis, which in the year 2017 killed more than 72,000 Americans. When you think about that, I mean, it's shocking. We lost 54,000 over 10 years in Vietnam soldiers. And here we are talking about in 1 year, 72,000 dead. I mean, it really is in many ways a war, but also the suicide epidemic. Between 1999 and 2015, suicide in the United States went up about 26%. And especially alarming were suicides in young folks, and especially young women, and a lot of middle-aged white males. I mean, it's really been just a horrific attack on our world. And Karen and I talk about this a lot in Living in a Mindful Universe. And to cut to the chase, I think a big part of the problem is the modern neuroscientific study of consciousness, which includes not only neuroscience, but also philosophy of mind, also parapsychology and all of its evidence for non-local consciousness, and also includes quantum physics, which is one of the deepest expressions of the mind-body question. And all of this is leading us towards an acknowledgement that mind is first and foremost, that in fact, consciousness is at the core of all that exists and comes out of this world. So in other words, these modern consciousness studies, as I said before, they fully support not only the reality of afterlife, but of reincarnation. So in this modern scientific discussion, and especially important for each and every one of us living today, is how do we take this information and put it to use in our own lives? And when it comes to that the big question you asked earlier about how do we deal with these hardships and challenges, I think it is in many ways, the answers lie within us all. And Karen and I, in addition to writing Living in a Mindful Universe, which I think is a fantastic book to tie together science and spirituality in the modern era, I would also highly recommend to your listeners an absolutely free course that's available on my website on ebenalexander.com. When you get to that website, little banner wiggles in your face, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. Click on that, leave your first name and an email address, and for 33 days, you'll get an email with a powerful new topic, one of 33 of the main big topics out of this revolutionary book. And then it starts bringing you along on the journey. And we discuss all these kind of astonishing features of quantum physics and of modern consciousness studies, of psychedelic drug studies, things like that, that are all showing us that consciousness is fundamental, that the brain is a filter, reducing valve that allows consciousness in. It does not create it. Consciousness is primordial. And we go into that in a lot of detail in the book, but also in this course. So I highly encourage people who want to learn a lot more about the scientific revolution about all this, take that course. And the best part about it is more than 8,000 people around the world have taken that course to date. Many of them leave comments. There's a language translate button there. So people from all over the world are participating, leaving comments, sharing experiences, helping each other. It's forming a tremendous community. And Karen and I are building off of that with something else, what's called the Inner Sanctum Center. But for right now, just focus on that 33-day course. It's completely free. And that gets everybody up to speed. And to cut to the chase, I believe that by connecting with our higher soul, which we can all do if we develop patterns of going within, of meditation, that enable us to turn off that little voice in the head, the voice of the ego, the little chatterbox, which Michael Singer, I love the way in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls the voice in your head your annoying roommate. Get that right. That's exactly it. And that little voice of the ego, it's also the voice of our rational, logical communication with other humans, but language is very, very limited. And many of the answers we seek cannot even be conveyed linguistically. And therefore, developing a pattern of going in, starting to explore consciousness, realizing your consciousness is not created by your brain, but it's actually allowed in through the filtering mechanism of the brain. Once you acknowledge that, you can use meditative techniques like sacred acoustics, which is a form of differential frequency brain entrainment. Karen Newell is the co-founder of that company with her business partner, Kevin Cossey. And if people visit sacredacoustics.com, they can learn about this incredibly powerful tool. Something as simple as sound can be even more powerful than things like strong psychedelic drugs to open the door and allow us to communicate and get to know much more richly that realm of consciousness that is right at the core of everything that emerges and occurs in this universe. So going within is a tremendous power. And the answers truly lie within us all. Once you realize within your mind is actually the best way to get out into the universe at large.
Wow, I love that so much. One of the things I do is I pull cards for my interviewees. So I thought I'd ask the universe you know, talk about what you just said about going within and really, you know, seeing. So I just love what you just said. So let's see what the cards have to say, just to
All right.
put an exclamation point on the whole scenario. So the first card is always the blockage card, and I pulled purification. And I absolutely love that, because blockage in that most people are so cluttered, right, in this day and age, with their devices and with, you know, just social media in general and screen time. And I mean, it really astounds me. I go out to dinner and people are literally sitting at the table, like 4 people, and they're all looking at phones instead of each other.
Yeah,
So you
really
can't go in when you're staring outside,
right.
you know, at something, right?
Right. And it's really a shame, because also in many ways we're sharing the one mind. So, you know, to be focused on your screen, you're not even letting the one mind engage through the souls that are involved there. So
That's right. That's right. Well, then the action card, I love it, is surrender. And I
surrender, I
think that
love
is,
that.
it is
Acceptance,
so, yeah,
surrender.
you must surrender. You must, you know, and again, I remember you saying this in one of your keynotes about how the brain is literally, it's filtering, you know, down, like the consciousness is coming within us through that filtered. And that was so powerful, because, you know, most of us think, oh no, it's coming inside and going out. No, it's a
No.
limiter. I mean, it's so vast and expansive. We're almost like these genies that are stuffed into these little, you know, spacesuits, and we can only, you know, attain so much within us. So that's why you have
And
to
I love that.
surrender and let it come through.
It's such an important concept. I've often thought that the greatest gifts we have as human beings in the modern world are always expressing gratitude, and also, when necessary, forgiveness. But I will absolutely say that surrender and acceptance are crucial once we realize that, in fact, the universe has our best interest at heart, and we can trust in this universe. That was one of the most beautiful messages of the story and proof of heaven, that guardian angel on the butterfly wing, and her message to me: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. That was not just a message for me, that was a message for each and every one of us. And gaining trust in this universe is very, very comforting and refreshing. So surrender and acceptance are crucial when you realize that the universe has your back and will end up taking care of you, as long as you have love in your heart, love for self and love for others. That unconditional love has infinite power to heal.
Wow, I absolutely love that. And that just goes hand in hand with the outcome card, which is essence, which is what we truly are. I mean, that is the core of our essence, is that unconditional love. And that's what we're here to, you know, so many near-death experiencers come back and say, oh my gosh, we're here to express love and to be love to one another. And, you know, we've come to this, to, you know, have this paradox or whatever, to see the light in the dark and the yin and the yang, and yet all it is just be love. And
yes. Well, it's an absolutely crucial message here. Of course, as you point out, that is the central message from near-death experiences. Of course, near-death experiences go back thousands of years across all cultures, all continents, and the similarities are shocking when you start to study them. These are not culturally derived at all, even though the interpretation of them can depend on your beliefs, the language you use to describe them, but the content is not. The content is something that is rich and original and comes from the universe. And, you know, that essence, I love that, because it really is, that's what we're really here to do, is to know thyself. I mean, that's the edict over the entrance to the temple of the oracle at Delphi in Greece. Know thyself. And when you realize, as modern consciousness studies are showing, that we're sharing one mind, and that all of this is really about the dream of the one mind, and we're all participating in that, but it is all one that is best focused through that knowledge of love and of acceptance, and that we're all in this together. And of course, it's not just about human beings. This is about all life throughout the universe. But if we can just focus on planet Earth, our animals, friends can have very rich kind of spiritual realities in existence. In fact, I often say in my talks that as much as our modern culture wants to say that the thing that makes human beings so special is their language, in many ways on this journey, our language and that voice of the ego and our little rational mind, in many ways can be misleading and can take us off target. And in many ways, it's really about learning to truly live in the now. As much as people like to think that time is something that's well understood in modern physics, the opposite is the case. Time is one of the deepest and most profound mysteries going. There seems to be a now that exists, and yet our memories of the past, although they contribute, in many ways, they only contribute as much as the data registers in the now. This is one of the deep and profound mysteries of quantum physics. John Archibald Wheeler pointed this out in what he called the participatory anthropic principle, based out of quantum physics, but it was really a strong principle that calls us into question everything we think we know about past and future, and how in many ways they are more of a kind of a symmetrical and malleable part of the now. But what we truly own is the now. And the more we can come into that in meditation, come to realize that eternity and the now have a lot in common, and that we can live in all of that at once, and it makes sense viewed from that higher perspective. But this is really about a fantastic journey of rejecting a lot of the nonsense of our materialistic science and what it's tried to teach us about the physical world being all that exists, but coming into a deeper knowing of consciousness that enables a far grander expression of our free will, and what I would say is the free will of the higher soul to manifest the world of our dreams. And that is something that is within our reach as this scientific revolution takes over this world.
Wow, that is just amazing. I just thank you for that so much. One last question, because it just brings to mind, I mean, it goes back to that kind of predetermination. I mean, here you were like steeped in scientific, materialistic, like this, you know, like you said, oh, what a coincidence that those things are happening. And yet you thought you knew, right? That they're in some sort of the part of their brain that's giving them those things. So what if you, I mean, you were like the forefront, you're the leader in bringing this forward for us. And I mean, what if you hadn't have had your near-death experience? I mean, where do you think you would be today? I mean, it just...
Well, you know, I think that it was my destiny, my higher soul and soul group purpose was to learn more about this. I mean, the thing about near-death experiences, as much as they have commonalities, so that scientists who study them pay big attention because of all those commonalities that are independent of culture, independent of prior beliefs, etc. And so that is absolutely crucial, but they're always tailored for the individual. That's the other thing to remember, is the only thing that's important in any of this is the individual growing to know themselves more, which is their relationship with the universe. And so NDEs are always steered towards the individual and that growth. And it just so happens that my particular growth also is a question that's of great interest to our culture at large and to the scientific community at large, because today consciousness is one of the most profound mysteries. In fact, I would say many scientists would put it number one in all the mysteries that face modern science is the nature of consciousness itself. And it turns out that where this revolution is going is 180 degrees opposite to where we all thought it was going when materialist science really held the reins. But materialist science has nothing to say about consciousness itself. Now, that's not to say that brain science and neuroscience aren't important. They are crucial, but don't expect to find all the answers in the brain. What we find is we get to these dead ends where we have to leap off and realize, well, it's not all happening in the brain. The brain is filtering, but there are layers of kind of coordination of information and knowing and the free will effect that are occurring outside of this physical universe that have everything to do with a measurement paradox in quantum physics and with this convergence of understanding. The good news is people don't have to wait until the scientific community wakes up to this. The scientific community is far on this pathway already. And for those who want to learn more about that, go to GalileoCommission.org. I'm one of the 100 plus scientific advisors on the group for Galileo Commission. Karen and I were over in London back in November of 2018 to support the launch of that manifesto. But if you go to that website and read that statement by Harold Wallach, and with the support of these 100+ scientists, including myself, you'll realize science is way on this pathway. It's still wide open in terms of where it's leading, but it definitely is not leading to the bleak and paltry fiction of materialist science that tries to pretend when your body dies, that's the end of your soul. That kind of thinking is going the way of the dodo because it's false. The evidence for afterlife and reincarnation in the scientific world, when you open your mind and study the evidence, because if you just assume you know the answer based on your own personal experience, of course, you're only going to get so far. But that's where science is so important. And in fact, I would say that's why we've had 5,000 years for religions based on experiences of a few prophets and mystics, where the question is, do you believe them? Do you have faith in what they say? We're now going to replace with the neuroscience of consciousness that shows all of this much bigger picture to be true. And that's where the individual can jump in full guns blazing, go to that 33-day course on my website, use sacredacoustics.com for deep meditation, start meditating daily, and the world is going to change dramatically, all for the better.
Wow, fantastic. Well, and I love you mentioned all of your links, and I'll of course have those on the website, and we'll have all the information there for the listeners if they want to check it out. But wow, thank you so much, Eben. This has been an amazing conversation. I can't wait to hear it again myself, because I'm just, what you downloaded today was super amazing. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I hope to talk again soon. Okay.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Exploring Death podcast. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Before you make any financial or legal decisions, consult a professional. This show is copyrighted by Exploring Death. Written permission must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.